Skloot is a science writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Oprah Magazine, Discover, Science, and many other outlets. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is her first book. It took her 10 years to do the work for this book, and it instantly became a New York Times bestseller. That almost never happens. I think we should congratulate her on that incredible achievement. It's simply fantastic to see so many people come out to discuss a book, and this book in particular. This is the second year, as you know, of the Go Big Read program, and tonight's event is the highlight in our first semester series of events. You've come for an evening with Rebecca Skloot, who is the author of the bestseller, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. So give me a big hearty Wisconsin welcome.
And I just have to say, before I start talking about the book, how deeply honored I am that the book was chosen for the Big Reads program. And not a day goes by where I don't feel incredibly lucky that mine is actually being read by large numbers of people, particularly students. The future scientists, the future lawyers, the future everythings, the future patients, people who really, I think, need to hear this story. So thank you very much for having me here and for reading the book. So I'm going to start off just by reading from the opening of the book, when Henrietta Lacks goes to the hospital for the first time, which is in many ways where this story starts. And before I do, just for those who aren't familiar with the term HeLa cells, it's spelled H-E-L-A, and it's an abbreviation for Henrietta's name. It's H-E for Henrietta and L-A for Lacks. On January 29th, 1951, David Lacks sat behind the wheel of his old Buick watching the rainfall. He was parked under a towering oak tree outside Johns Hopkins Hospital with 3 of his children, 2 still in diapers, waiting for their mother, Henrietta. The day before, Henrietta went to the bathroom and found blood spotting her underwear. She filled her bathtub, lowered herself into the warm water, and spread her legs. With the door closed to her children, husband, and cousins, Henrietta slid a finger inside herself and rubbed it across her cervix until she found what she somehow knew she'd find: a hard lump deep inside, as though someone had lodged a marble just to the left of the opening to her womb. Henrietta climbed out of the bathtub, dried herself off and dressed. Then she told her husband, "You better take me to the doctor. I'm bleeding, and it ain't my time." So Henrietta went back to the hospital and went under anesthetic, and without telling her, before applying the treatment to her tumor, her doctor just cut a little piece of her tumor and put it in a dish. And he sent that down the hall to George Guy, who was the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. And George Guy and many other scientists had been trying to grow human cells for decades, and it had never worked. They would sometimes survive for a day or 2, but they would all eventually die. And no one knows exactly why, but Henrietta's cells just never died. And the other question that I want to address in there is why her cells grew. This is one of the most common questions I get. So, okay, it was a mystery in 1951 why her cells grew. We must know now, right? And we actually really don't. It's sort of a fascinating part of the story in that her cells grew, and then scientists just sort of ran with them and started doing research, and they never really looked back. So no one ever stopped to wonder, why did her cells grow when all these other cells died? And so we still don't really have the answer to that question. But one of the things we know about Henrietta's cells is that one of the things that made them so valuable for science is that they grew with this incredible intensity. So within 24 hours of her leaving the hospital, her cells were doubling their numbers every 24 hours. They were in 1 dish, and then 2, and then 4, and then 8, and sort of really quickly took over the lab. And the same thing happened in her body. So the cells, that nickel-sized tumor, spread to almost every organ in her body, and she died within about 8 months of being diagnosed. So the volume of cells that grew from that one little sample is sort of inconceivable. There's one scientist calculated that if you could have saved them all and put them on a scale, that by today they'd weigh more than 50 million metric tons, which is more than 150 Empire State Buildings. And cells weigh almost nothing, so it's an amazing number of cells. And they were used to do a lot of very important science. They were used to help develop the polio vaccine. They went up in the first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. Her cells were the first ever cloned. Her genes were some of the first ever mapped. We can trace a lot of our most important cancer medications, the HPV vaccine, all sorts of important advances that we rely on today back to research on her cells.
So, while I sort out these questions, Christoph has a strong sense that Hopkins has the responsibility to the Lacks family, at least as you reported. You don't really take a stand on that, do you?
No, I don't. Could everybody hear the questions, the mic in the back? No, I don't take a stand. I felt like it was very important in this book for me to convey the various sides of the story and put them out there to the world and essentially say, discuss. There are a lot of issues that are raised in the book, everything from access to education, race and class and healthcare, and this big question of, does someone owe something to the Lacks family? Does science, and actually Christoph, he really felt like science owed something to the family. He didn't have a particular, I think he was very happy to be at Hopkins and to be able to offer them something, and I think he felt like Hopkins, in a sense, owed them information. He was so astonished that when he found out that still, at that point, this was decades after the family first learned about the cells, they'd been asking questions of people at Hopkins for years, and it was just dumbfounding to him that no one had tried to answer those questions. So I think he felt like they owed the family information. And Christoph definitely was of the mind that, if people are profiting off of these things, why shouldn't the family profit? That's not, it's one of the things that's interesting about this story is that everybody has their own take on that issue. And I felt like my job was to put it out there to get people to sort of think about what is your take on that issue? Do you think that science owes the family money? Do you think that it's everyone's sort of duty to donate samples to science, to move science forward, because everyone, essentially benefits? That's often been the thinking, though of course complicates things in the United States when not everyone does actually benefit because we don't all have access to healthcare. So I tried to put all of these things out there to start a discussion, and one of the, I think it was very important to me to not demonize the scientists, and I often hear from readers that they flip-flop. The book is structured in this braided way where you jump back and forth in time and between the Lacks family story and the scientists. And I often hear from readers who say, I was reading the science section and I was like, yay, science is awesome, this is all great. And then I got to the family section and I was like, boo, science, that was really bad what they did to the family. And that tells me that, that was what I wanted really, because you cannot look at this story and say, this science is bad, we don't want this to happen, and it shouldn't have happened. So I wanted to challenge that without putting my opinions in there and saying, this is what I think you should think.